Our next speaker is Paul Shapiro, and you might have, upon registration, received Paul Shapiro's book, Clean Meat, a great resource when we started looking into clean meat and cell-based meat technologies. And so I would like to introduce Paul Shapiro from Better Meat Co.
Thank you, Alex. So 6 months ago, I was right here. I had come, Alex was so kind, he invited my girlfriend Tony and I to come in here to visit him at work, and it was really nice of him, and he brought us into this space. And he declared that I want to have a conference here someday. And I thought, that's cool. Lots of people say they want to do things. And he had already started this podcast, which I was already a listener of and was honored to be a guest on. But Alex, I was like, cool, okay, he wants to have a conference. So GFI is doing a conference. There's other conferences. Like, yeah, of course there'll be a conference. And yet, 6 months later, here we are. And that's the difference between people who say they want to do things and talk about doing things and people who actually do things. So please give a big round of applause, not only to Alex, but to Anita and every single other person who helped bring us all here together. All right, I'm just going to say, it's late in the day. You all have been doing lots of things. You've heard really fascinating speakers. But this dude and the organizers and you deserve to stand up and stretch. So give them a round of applause, a standing ovation, and stretch your legs, because I'm going to probably talk for about 90 minutes. All right. Now he's giving himself a standing ovation. Okay. Okay. Let me tell you all a story. Imagine the following scenario. Imagine that there is a commodity. And this commodity is very sought after. People really like it. People go all over the world. People really like this commodity. Yet, there's a couple problems. Because for as long as anybody can remember, the only way to get this commodity was from nature. But there were a lot of concerns about how that commodity was obtained. Environmentalists decried the practices to obtain this, saying it was destroying the planet. Human rights advocates lamented how the labor conditions were for the people in this industry. They even developed third-party certification programs to try to make these products more ethical so that people could buy it and ease their conscience. Then imagine that some innovative scientists developed a way to produce that same product inside of a laboratory without any of those concerns associated to it. And no, I don't mean an alternative to that product. I don't mean a substitute for that product. I mean molecularly the same exact product. Some Bay Area startups start trying to commercialize it, and all of a sudden the incumbent industry is so upset that they go to the government and they try to ban them from using a term that is being used in the common marketplace. And the purveyors of this product want to call it cultured. And the incumbent industry says, no, you have to call it lab-grown. Well, consumers don't want lab-grown. They want cultured. Well, you can't call it cultured. And they go to a federal agency to try to get them to ban it. Now, you may be thinking that I am talking about meat. But that commodity is not meat. That commodity is diamonds. For years, way to go, good for you. One person there knew it, all right. For as long as anybody can remember, the only way to get diamonds was from mining them out of the earth, gashing huge holes into the earth and creating massive environmental problems, so much that even today we're mining diamonds on the bottom of the ocean. We even have terms like conflict diamonds or blood diamonds. We had Leo DiCaprio starred in the movie Blood Diamond. And you had a Kimberley process named after the city in South Africa where this process was to try to certify third party that these diamonds were ethically mined. Well, enter the advent of lab-grown diamonds. All of a sudden, we have a way to produce real diamonds so identical to the mined diamonds that with a microscope, even the most skilled jeweler can't tell the difference because they are diamonds. Now, ladies in the audience, raise your hand if your heart would melt if your sweetheart offered you, said, be mine, I want a lab-grown diamond, right? Okay, there's a couple saying Marie Gibbons, of course, would love that. I would love it too, actually. But most people, their hearts don't melt at the thought of a lab-grown diamond. Cultured diamond, though, sounds kind of like a cultured pearl, right? Interestingly enough, 99% of the pearls produced today in the jewelry market are cultured pearls. So these startups that are selling these diamonds want to call them cultured diamonds. Big problem, though, is that the FTC has a definition for diamond. You know what that definition says? It says a natural, emphasis on natural mineral, that under pressure was carbon that was pressured into an isometric form. Well, Big Diamond, epitomized by De Beers, lobbied to try to get the FTC to ban these folks from using terms like cultured diamond. They wanted them not even to be called diamonds. They just said lab-grown gems or something like that, despite the fact that these are exactly the same. In fact, they're so exact that, yes, there's a jewelry market for diamonds, but there also, interestingly enough, is a big market for diamonds in medical and semiconductor and other industrial uses where they need diamonds. And that, because the so-called lab-grown diamonds can be produced for 1/3 cheaper than mined diamonds, the industrial market has already switched in a large part over to these lab-grown diamonds. In fact, you know how long it takes for a diamond to form under the earth? Millennia. Anybody know how fast you can grow a diamond in a lab? 1 week. Well, my friends, very interestingly, the FTC just changed its definition of diamond. And they ruled in the little guy and removed the word natural from the definition of a diamond. So now a diamond is a diamond regardless of its production. It is functionally and molecularly the same, and no longer does a diamond have to be naturally formed. It can be formed by the human hand. And the FTC explicitly allows now the term cultured diamond. So think about that. What might be possible if the clean meat or cultured meat industry were to have the same type of lobbying prowess that the startups here in the Bay Area had on this particular issue? And they demonstrated that they are functionally identical, that there's not a difference. It's not like plant-based meat, which, as Brian in the last panel correctly pointed out, is similar to meat, but it isn't molecularly identical to meat. But in the case of growing real meat from animal cells, of course, it is the same thing. And so might we, as a movement that is interested in getting clean or cultured meat onto the market and having it identified as meat, have the same success? Already, cultured diamonds are 2% of the jewelry market for diamonds. What percentage of the meat market is grown from animal cells? Anybody know? 0. Right, so they're at 2%. Now, I think that there's a lot of room for improvement both for the diamond market and for the cellular agriculture market. And I look back at other types of transitions and see the same exact thing. Think back 150 years ago, where, for example, there was a massive ice industry. What do you mean an ice industry? I mean they were harvesting big blocks of ice out of lakes in New England and shipping it all around the world to places like India, where nobody ever seen ice in their entire lives before. Now, lest you think it was actual Indians who wanted this ice, it was actually the British colonists who were having a hard time in the subcontinental heat. They wanted their ice there. Well, enter the advent of industrial refrigeration. And all of a sudden, you have a much more efficient way to produce ice simply by cooling the water down right in front of you. Well, the ice shipping barons of that time, Big Ice, was livid over this technological innovation, railing against what they called artificial ice, saying it wasn't safe, it wasn't ice, it was dangerous, the ammonia in the coolant could leak out and harm you. Well, the irony at the time was that actually the naturally formed ice was far less safe because, one, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing, so there's a lot of pollution in the water, and how do you think they got the ice out of there? It's not like they had tractors or cars, they had horses. And guess what? Horses don't exactly hold it in when they're doing their work. And so you have these horses in polluted lakes pulling ice out of there, going to the bathroom in it, versus ice that had been cooled down through refrigeration where the water was filtered or boiled or otherwise purified prior to it. And so the so-called artificial ice was actually safer than the naturally formed ice. Sound familiar? Fast forward to today, and virtually every, well, not virtually, I would be willing to guess that every single one of us in this room at least has an artificial ice maker in our homes. We call them freezers. We don't think there's anything unnatural about it at all. In fact, you probably would not even consider living in an apartment or a home that didn't have an artificial ice maker, and you, of course, would not call it an artificial ice maker. Might the same thing happen when we're thinking about meat, or about diamonds for that matter? Might the same thing occur that future generations will think it's the natural thing just to have a piece of equipment in their home, that in the same way it might be totally unremarkable for you to have a bread maker or an ice cream maker or an ice maker, to have a meat maker in your home? Might you be ordering from New Age Meats little cell bags, little tea bags of cells where you can make your own steaks, or maybe you'll end up making your own turducken, right? So you can have like turkey cells, chicken cells, and duck cells, and mix them up and make your own really cool meats at home. Now, that technology isn't possible today, but maybe in the future it will be. But I do want to stress a couple things, because it's important for us to remember that, yes, I was at the USDA FDA meeting last week and heard people there talking about the desire to make this happen in the year 2019 so people can come onto the market. That's very nice. It's great. I hope that it happens. But one, you still had people there who were opposed to this technology and opposed to even calling it meat, first of all. So the same thing with diamonds and with ice is happening with meat right now. But it did seem pretty likely that it would be called meat based on at least what the Secretary of Agriculture and the FDA Commissioner were saying. But even if this does come on the market in 2019, which, these companies mostly are saying that they intend to commercialize by 2021. But even if it does come onto the market in 2019, did anybody here read reports about the UN climate change report recently? Anybody? All right, most hands go up. They said that we are in deep doo-doo by 2030 if we don't take drastic action to dramatically change our behavior that is heating up our climate by 2030. And how deep is that doo-doo? Deep enough that it is civilization-threateningly deep. Well, what do you think is the most wildly optimistic scenario for a clean meat industry? What do you think if these products come on the market in the next couple years before they actually start making an actual dent in the meat market? Let's look at plant-based meats. They've been on the market for decades. You know what percentage of the meat market is plant-based meat? Less than 1%. At least there's a success story in the plant-based milk space, where a decade ago it was also about 1%, and now it's 13% of the fluid milk that is sold in the US comes from soy milk or almond milk or coconut milk, or etc. But still, that means that about 9 out of 10 milk cartons today are still coming from cows. And so even if a cellular agriculture industry does come about, and even if it does wildly successful and plant-based meats quadruple in popularity, what percentage of the meat market is still going to be coming from factory farming? Probably like 95% by 2030 would be an optimistic guess. And so that raises this question, well, what can we actually do? Because there's nobody more bullish on clean meat than I am, pun intended, bullish, haha. But, thank you. The fact is that we need more. In the same way that the problem of fossil fuels is so great that you want many alternatives. You want wind, you want solar, you want geothermal, and you want more. The problem of factory farms is so great that you need many different alternatives. Yes, you want clean meat. Yes, you want plant-based meats. However, we need more than that. Sure, we need people simply to eat less meat, or maybe people will become vegetarian. Maybe some portion of people will do that. But I do think that there's another option that two friends and I, who are here in the audience today, are exploring. And let me tell you about that. Imagine a situation where, let's say, you are the director of dining at a corporate cafeteria, let's say in Cincinnati. And now let's say you're serving pork sausages. One day you decide, I want to do the right thing. I'm going to offer vegan sausages next to the pork sausages. And let's just say that by some miracle you can offer them for the same exact price, even though there's no plant-based meat on the market today that's really sold cost competitively with commodity meat. But let's just say you can offer it at the same price. Knowing what you know when the employees start filing in for lunch, what percentage of them who would have purchased the pork sausage do you think are going to switch permanently to the new vegan sausage? What percentage do you think? 1, 5? Yeah, I'd say it's in that range. What if, though, you had an opportunity not to reduce the pork consumption by 1 to 5%, but what if you could reduce it by 30%? And let's say you could reduce it by 30% without persuading a single individual to make a different behavioral change when they go into that cafeteria. How would you do that? Simple. Many people are enthused, as am I, about companies like Beyond Meat putting their products directly in the meat aisle, out of the ghetto of the natural foods frozen section in the supermarket and into the prime real estate in the meat aisle. Well, we at the Better Meat Co., which is a company that my co-founders Joanna Bromley and Adam Yee have founded this year, want to go beyond putting plant-based proteins in the meat aisle, and we want to put it directly in the meat itself. So imagine if, in addition to offering the plant-based sausage, which of course they should do, they also changed their recipe for the pork sausage from 100% pork to, let's say, 70% pork and 30% plant-based protein. And so we at the Better Meat Co. are making plant-based protein mixes that are formulated specifically to be blended seamlessly into animal meat, not only to reduce meat and to reduce saturated fat and cholesterol and total calories, but actually to make it better. So that if you are that director of dining, you can make your meat better by using less animal meat. Already, you can go into a Chinese restaurant in San Francisco right now. If you were to order the pork bun or a pork dumpling, you might be getting our product. There's even one clean meat company purchasing from us so they can cut it into their animal cells to improve the taste of them. But that's the premise behind blending as another option. This is an and, not an or. We've heard that before. And so this idea of blending so that you blur the very identity of what people consider meat to be is another way of helping us to meet the goals by 2030 that, frankly, are almost, I shouldn't say almost, that are an existential problem that we really have. So when I think about all of these alternatives, when I think about the success that the cultured diamond industry had that we talked about, or the ice industry, and what I think is going to happen with the clean or cultured meat industry, I also think about the success that we're going to have as a community on plant-based meats, on meat reduction, and yes, on blending. Because if we want to get to a day where we have actually solved the problem that we are seeking to solve, what other option do we have that is actually realistic? I'd argue there isn't another option. That is a silver bullet that is going to more quickly solve this problem. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, you want to solve this problem? It's just too gargantuan. We're talking about a problem that's just too big. You can never solve it. It's impossible. Well, a lot of things seemed impossible. I mean, it seemed impossible for somebody to go to prison for nearly 30 years and come out as the president of his country, and yet that's exactly what Nelson Mandela did, who said it always seems impossible until it's done. Just think about in our own country the things that seemed impossible. 200 years ago, the legitimate social debate in our country was whether one human being ought to be able to own another human being. Respectable members of society held both views on that. Doctors, lawyers, members of Congress. I mean, long before Abraham Lincoln assumed the presidency, they were arguing that slavery was the natural condition. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they all had slaves. The great thinkers from Aquinas to Augustine all believed that slavery was normal and natural. Today, thankfully, we all basically stipulate that slavery is a moral abomination, but a blink of an eye ago, historically speaking, that was hardly the case. 100 years ago, we were debating whether the children of the poor should be forced to labor in coal mines and factories, with American industrialists regularly winning at the Supreme Court, striking down child labor laws as unconstitutional. 50 years ago, we were debating whether whites and blacks simply ought to be able to share the same drinking fountains, something hardly fathomable to those of us who didn't live through the vicious Jim Crow era. And so what might the world be like 20 years from now? What practices of ours might our descendants find as objectionable as we find from our parents or our grandparents? It's so easy for us to condemn the social views of those who came before us without self-reflectively considering our own views and what might be deemed totally unacceptable by our descendants. Do we really think that they are going to take a kind view of the way that we treated animals on factory farms? Of the cages that we forced animals to languish in for their entire lives, barely able even to move an inch or to turn around? I mean, we don't treat the most heinous criminals in our society the way that we treat farm animals. We don't take murderers and rapists and put them in jail cells so small that they can't lift their arms or they can't turn around. Yet, what crime did these chickens and pigs commit to deserve that type of punishment? And of course, the answer is none. They simply committed the crime of being born into the wrong species. And I contend that just in the same way that as we freed ourselves from the need to engage in other forms of exploitation, that type of exploitation became more morally odious to us than it had in the past. Because it's very difficult, as Upton Sinclair, author of The Jungle, said, it's really difficult to get somebody to understand something that their living depends on them not understanding. And so think about, in the same way that we used to rely on whaling to light our homes. Imagine 150 years ago telling somebody that 150 years hence that there will be an entire industry of people who just pay a lot of money to get on a boat and go look at a whale. They would think it was crazy. Yet today, we aren't a leader in whale killing as we once were. We're now a leader in whale watching. Or imagine 100 years ago, maybe 130 years ago, telling somebody that horses are largely going to be seen as companion animals. They would think you were insane. But we are much more able to take a sentimental view of whales and of horses, not because humane sentiment freed those animals, but rather because kerosene and cars were invented. And I believe that the work that so many people in this room are doing to create the kerosene and the cars and the lab-grown diamonds and the cultured meat, and yes, the artificial ice too, that we are going to change our social views about what we deem as ethically acceptable into the future, because we will no longer be tied by necessity to thinking that the actions that we're taking toward animals and toward the planet today are somehow either acceptable or maybe inevitable, as many people will proclaim. And so I'm grateful to each and every one of you for everything that you are doing. The work that you are doing to try to bring about a better society, whether you host a podcast like my friend Neil, who's podcast One Green Planet, I highly recommend, great podcast. Whether you're doing things like Christy Middleton at the Humane Society is working with amazing people to get institutions like hospitals and schools to use less meat in their cafeterias. Whether you are just a social media promoter of the cultured meat industry and you think that you want to help increase consumer acceptance, or maybe you're thinking of leaving your job to start a company because you're sick of doing something that you don't feel like has a great meaning in the world, that you want to leave a better legacy than the current job that you have. I'm not looking at you, by the way. You know who you are. Just kidding. But the point is that whatever you are doing and whatever you are going to do, I'm so grateful to you. Because this type of social progress, whether it comes from entrepreneurs or from advocates, never happens in a self-executing manner. It's not like people are wearing cultured diamonds on their hands because it was just some inevitable turn of history that occurred. It's because scientists and entrepreneurs and lobbyists came together to make it happen. And the same is happening with the clean meat industry now, and the same is happening with the plant-based meat and milk industries, and yes, the plant-based egg industry now as well. And I think the same is going to be so even for the very definition of what we consider to be meat, as we continue to see a blending of plant-based and animal-based meats together. I'm convinced that we are going to have a better future, but not that it'll happen on its own. It'll only happen because people like you help to turn the arc of history to make it a better world. I think that we can do it. I'm grateful to each and every one of you for everything that you're doing to bring about a more ethical, a more humane, and yes, a more cultured future. Thank you.